Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Hello world, you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. A happy new year to all our listeners. We hope that you had a great Christmas and New Year's break. Needless to say, the world did not stop and take a breath during this time. But never fear, we are back to help you make sense of this mess. The year 2017 was dominated by one man, US President Donald J. Trump. Love him or hate him, Trump, the human headline, was never far from any leading news story. Whether it was him signaling a shift away from globalism to focus on America first, his flaky and highly unstable inner circle, his relentless Twitter feed, and his confrontational anti-diplomatic style, the Russia investigation, the Korea war talk, he was the broom that swept through Washington, D.C. In its wake, 1 year into Trump's first term, the United States is weaker and less influential than it was, even under the more studied yet tepid leadership of former President Barack Obama. Alliance relationships, long the glue of US power, are unraveling. Key European states are actively looking for ways to uncouple themselves from an increasingly erratic Trans-Pacific partner. NATO is looking weak and irrelevant. Germany and France are attempting to form a robust sovereign leadership of that continent that it hasn't seen since the 1920s. Whether it gets there is yet to be determined. The EU is fracturing. Brexit is a reality everyone is getting used to, although its cost, social, economic and political, is enormous. Eastern Europe is steadily creating its own strategic space. Poland and Romania are now the new American bulwarks against Russian interests, though the internal politics of both countries, as well as Hungary, are looking more autocratic and less Western. And by autocratic, we mean fascist. The rise of the right in Europe is spreading, and this phenomenon will reshape the continent. Already, the poorer states of southern Europe are struggling to hold together. Spain was dealt a major blow, with a second referendum on Catalonian independence coming in with a higher vote in favour of breaking away than the first referendum, hardly an endorsement of Madrid's handling of this crisis. Italian banks, teetering on the brink of collapse, have yet to move away from the precipice, while the Greek economy is no stronger than it was after its crash back in 2008, in spite of numerous bailouts and a 1930s-style austerity economy. Russia and China are rushing into the international vacuum left by the Trump presidency. Russia is probing NATO defences at this time of American weakness and lack of resolve, whether it be in the Baltics, challenging British sea and air power, stepping up its warlike actions in the frozen conflict of eastern Ukraine, consolidating its control over Damascus and Syria. Russia is back, and it means business. China is consolidating its control over its restive internal territories, determined to crush all resistance there. It is keeping a watchful eye over events in Korea and is in a very strong position to force even more territorial concessions against the weaker claimants of the South China Sea. Short of war, China is already in a highly advantageous position and is unlikely to be rolled back in this strategically important patch of water. The Middle East, always in chaos, has tilted further toward existential crisis. Protests broke out in Iran toward the end of 2017, with people from all over Iran calling for the removal of the mullahs, some even calling for the reinstallment of the previous Pahlavi dynasty. And of course, there was Donald Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as the undivided capital of Israel, something that will haunt Israeli and American interests in the Middle East for a generation or more, while the turmoil unleashed by the young, powerful, reform-minded Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is likely to create its own flock of black swan events in the Gulf region, with effects to be felt far into the future. Meanwhile, back in Australia, far removed from most centres of international crisis, Canberra is desperate to hold on to its Western, Anglo-based culture, while at the same time appeasing the remorseless influence of Beijing. This is Australia's contemporary and future dilemma. Sinophiles, many of them former politicians, backed by the deep pockets of anonymous and sometimes known Chinese donors, will make the case that as China becomes more powerful vis-à-vis the United States, geography and economic reality will dictate Australia coming closer to China politically, socially and militarily. While Australia may never become a full tributary state of China, it is certainly possible to imagine a time when Sinophiles in Parliament will become a strong vocal minority, arguing for the country to erode its remaining cultural, economic and military ties to the United States. Today, Strategicon is being recorded in the historic Naval, Military and Air Force Club in Adelaide. Pictures will be available on the SIA Facebook site, and a potted history of the club will be on our show notes. For this episode, research assistant Ms. Shahrazad Ghairat will be in the driver's seat. So now sit back and relax while we look at the year that was and gaze into our crystal ball to see where 2018 will take us.
Hello, John and David. So my first question is to you, John. Let's go back to 2017. So was 2017 as good as it could have been, or could the year have actually been worse than it was? And if so, how?
Thanks for the question, and I think that we'll start off by saying, yes, the year could have been much, much worse. We only have to look at all the crises that we had to go through last year to find that the whole year basically operated on a toss of a coin. I mean, we could have had war with North Korea. We could have had the Americans walk away from the Iran nuclear deal. We could have had a Sino-US trade war. We could have seen civil war break out in Spain. There was just so many things that were happening during this year. And yet so far, so good. So far, things have been bad, but they haven't actually slipped off into the abyss. Now, does that mean that 2018 is going to be another lucky year for us? Well, I don't think that that's going to be the case. I think that what we're seeing at the moment is that there are some very dangerous trends out there, and those very factors and many, many other things that we'll discuss on this podcast may actually come to fruition in 2018. I think 2018 is going to be a very fundamental year for a lot of the issues that are bubbling away in Europe, in Asia, in North America, and obviously in Africa as well, in the Middle East.
Good. How about you, David? What do you think?
I got sick of the doom and gloom merchants telling us how bad 2017 was, relative to how much worse it could have been. I think we were very lucky. Now, the inevitable consequence of that is that we dodged multiple bullets, but they're still in the air and they're still moving and they're still looking for targets. No tensions were resolved, no problems were resolved, so there's still masses of pressure, lots of problems, and we just can't keep not resolving things. At some point, not resolving things will just become overwhelming and things will have to crack somewhere and somehow. And 2018, we might dodge the bullets all over again, but inevitably, things have to crack at some point.
That's right. So, second question then, David. In your opinion, what was the key 2017 foreign policy issue that will continue to drive events this year?
I think the key thing that came out of last year is we've got used to the idea that America is not willing or able to use huge amounts of power effectively. And what we saw was a whole new level of United States ineffectiveness last year. And the world keeps saying, oh, we'd like it if the Americans weren't so powerful, but then no one's willing to step up and do the job. So the more ineffective America becomes, the more we need someone else to step up. But we're not seeing any improvement in behaviour from anyone else. So really, our problem from last year is the Americans are progressively more ineffective, but no one else is actually taking on the role of peacemaker, conciliator, engager to find common ground in difference.
John, do you agree?
Look, I actually agree with everything David said. The only caveat that I would say, if we're looking at a particular event which will have very long-lasting implications. It will be America's recognition of Jerusalem as the undivided capital of Israel. I think that while at the moment the Middle East is still kind of trying to come to terms with this new position, the idea of having taken East Jerusalem off the table for a final Palestinian settlement is one of the single most, well, dare I say, silly moves that Israel could have done in terms of its longer-term security outlook. For the moment, the Arab states generally seem to be wound up in their own problems, so much so that they don't want to add to that by necessarily fueling any sort of anti-Israeli intifada among the Palestinians. But I think it's only going to be a matter of time before something of that nature will come about. Now, that could be because one Arab state or maybe a cabal of Arab states or maybe even some non-state actors will then take up the Palestinian cause, because we know the feckless leadership of the Palestinian National Authority under Mahmoud Abbas is incapable of actually working out what to do, because he's trying to keep his job, he's trying to make sure that the Palestinian Authority stays as unified as it possibly can be, although we know that's not the case. And the Israelis are making hay while the sun shines, but in the end, there will be those bad guys who will see this step as being antithetical to an issue that lies at the very heart. It's the very center, if I can borrow a phrase from our dear colleague Imad Harb. It's the heart of the Middle East from an Arab and a Muslim perspective. It's what to do about Palestine and finding a settlement. If we leave this wound open, I think only bad things are going to transpire.
I agree. Now, thinking back to 2017, I think we can agree that two events in the Middle East, the U.S. recognition of Jerusalem as the undivided capital of Israel, and the breakout of mass demonstration in Iran, may well shape the outcome of the region this coming year. John, how do you see these two events?
Look, I think that it would be fair to see both Israel and Iran as two poles in the Middle East. On the one side, Israel is the most powerful country in the Middle East. It's got the nuclear weapons, it's got the conventional military forces that can basically keep all comers at the other side of the border of Israel quite comfortably. Iran, on the other hand, is a power that has been trying to create for itself a strategic footprint, and quite successfully so. I mean, it's basically extended Iranian power. Iraq is a satrapy of Iran, and of course Bashar al-Assad is allied to Iran, and so therefore Iranian power now extends right to the eastern Mediterranean, which gives it almost a clear run to send supplies into southern Lebanese Hezbollah. It allows Iran to exercise a sort of level of strategic influence in that region. It's the other pole that is the most difficult one for the West to actually come to grips with. The Israelis, on the other hand, are protected by the United States, and so in one sense they can feel secure. But now in Iran, we're seeing a totally different situation appear. We've got mass demonstrations against the mullahs in Tehran. How this is going to actually now bring about Iran's evolution to a next level is anyone's guess. Obviously, with the mass protests, the likelihood of chaos coming about as a consequence of these protests not going away, not being able to be handled by the mullahs in Tehran, is quite real as we move forward into 2018.
David, are Israel and Iran the places to watch?
I think they're always the places to watch, and as much as ever. I think Israel feel they've got such a victory in being able to call Jerusalem their capital, but this just creates... The situation with Palestine has always been intractable, and it seems silly to say something is more intractable, but it's just made their situation more intractable. Whereas in the case of Iran, Iranian sophistication at growing power, gaining influence, means that even now with protests, they have apparently learnt so much, developed so many skill sets, have good relationships with China, good relationship with Russia. I really can't conceive how popular uprising in Iran can lead to anything other than a move perhaps from the Ayatollahs to the Revolutionary Guard and to something more reminiscent of a conventional authoritarian party with an even tighter grip on a population, in that, like China, you give the general populace a bit more freedom, but you don't give them political rights. So I think we'll see change in Iran, but it won't be warm, fuzzy democracy. It will just be a more conventional authoritarian state rather than a theocratic authoritarian state.
If I can just chime in here, David, do you think that we can look at this so-called calls for the return of the Pahlavi dynasty with any degree of legitimacy, or do you think that this is just something that's come out of left field and perhaps the Israelis and the Americans are playing a strange game among the protesters?
I think it's tapping into this idea where so many young Iranians abroad refer to themselves as Persians. And it's tapping into this idea that the idea of the Ayatollahs and the theocracy is so inimical to so many young Iranians, it doesn't mean anything. So if you can get rid of them in favour of a family who are corrupt and inept, but at least not Ayatollahs, it's another line to spin. It's another way to divide the population. It's another way to divide identity. It's a way to try and sow seeds of discontent within the populace.
So thinking back to 2017, we can't avoid the topic of North Korea. David, last year, North Korea was the subject of a lot of war talk between both US President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Things between the Koreans seem much calmer now than they were in 2017. Have we turned a corner? Was Trump's eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation with Pyongyang the thing that turned the situation around, as Trump himself claims? Or is this a brief spell of calm before the storm?
I think we inevitably have to have calm periods with the North Korean issue, because the North Koreans need to reassess what did they win, what did they lose. The idea that Trump achieved anything, if he achieved anything, it was to more effectively show the North Koreans whether they can or cannot rely on the Chinese. That the Americans kept screaming for the Chinese to help and control North Korea, and the Chinese were only willing to do so much, which gives North Korea an idea of how much latitude it's got to provoke both Washington and Beijing. I think this week the idea of a joint Korean team going to the Winter Olympics under one flag, a combined ice hockey team, shows that everything and anything is willing to be explored. The North Korean regime are always looking for an angle, and they don't have a lot of choices. Now that the world knows that oil is being transferred from ships to ships, this may limit their ability to get energy, and yet North Korea has always got the bargaining chip of, we can light up South Korea, we can create havoc, we can force the world into the Koreas, therefore putting the West on China's border. It can't get better from little quiet periods or through conflagration. And yet we don't really see yet any indication that the North Koreans are ready for consistent, meaningful dialogue, that the West has learnt not to provoke, and that China has found a midpoint where it doesn't need North Korea economically, doesn't really even want them socially. It just wants a buffer between the West and it. So if the Koreans want to get on with this, maybe they've taken a first step towards resolving more small issues on their own. But I think the only way it can progressively get better is if the Koreans make it better by ignoring everyone else.
John?
Look, I think first and foremost we have to say one thing, and that is that the US is not well prepared for war in Korea. I mean, they are just not prepared to counter even a North Korean ICBM strike against US territory, even if that were to come to pass. Seoul is happy to reach an accommodation with Pyongyang to reduce tensions, obviously not trusting the incoherent direction of Trump's diplomacy. So is Trump actually responsible for the Seoul-Pyongyang détente that we're currently seeing leading up to the Winter Olympics? Well, I suppose indirectly he is. But in the end, I think that what we're seeing now, is, as David said, is that the contestants on the ground are now starting to actually come to the fore. And in many ways, maybe Kim Jong-un will come out of this, much better than he would have in many other ways. Because ultimately, if he can thaw relations with Seoul and then allow people to think that the problem is over while he's still secretly working on the ICBM program, building more nuclear weapons, and once there's another diplomatic stoush with the United States, it's on again, we have to then think we were lulled into a trap, thinking that basically Kim Jong-un was legitimate this time round and reaching out to Seoul, but perhaps he's not. Perhaps this is all part of an elaborate trap. Now, we've heard a lot in the media about this notion that the United States may try to create a so-called bloody nose attack, where they may identify a particular target within North Korea and attack that target in the hope that North Korea understands that this is only meant to be a limited military action. Now, whether or not the Americans actually have the capacity to pull this kind of thing off is anyone's guess. I would suggest that any kind of bloody nose attack would not be something that can be easily contained by the Americans or the South Koreans. I think that the trump card, pardon the pun, that the North Koreans have is, as David said, they can unleash hell on Seoul. And this is the thing that I think is always going to be something that American policymakers will have to keep in the back of their minds, even when, indirectly they're leaking kind of statements suggesting that the military option is on the table and they have everything under control. I don't think they have anything under control at all.
Anything to say, David?
No, just to sort of reiterate what John said, the idea that the Americans have anything under control, or even that the Chinese have anything under control in terms of North Korea, is wishful thinking. North Korea maintain that ability to stymie everyone's efforts because it's the only thing they can do. They're so little, they're so under-resourced. All they can do is use the limited resources they have to create the biggest mess possible if things kick off. They don't have a second choice.
I agree. Well, let us go back to Africa for a second. John, in November 2017, long-term African dictator Robert Mugabe resigned from power after 37 years. Now, much of Africa seems to be reassessing its love affair with political liberalism. However, many African states are in danger of backsliding into autocracy. With US President Trump having used vulgar language to disparage Africa in one of Trump's first major controversies for this year, what sort of partner will the US make for the African continent?
Yeah, good question, Jez. Well, I think that what we can say so far is that moving forward, Trump's America and anything that emulates Trump's America post-Trump is going to be a very unreliable partner. I mean, look, the Americans want to extend their presence in Africa. They want to be able to fight terrorism in places like Somalia. They need to have the local people on board. But now that Trump has made it very clear what he thinks of African and people of African descent, I think that those very people are going to sit back and think very seriously about whether or not they actually want to get into bed with the Americans and do anything for them. And this is going to be something that will play very much into China's hand. I mean, look, China obviously pretty much owns the African continent lock, stock and two smoking barrels. Yes, there's European influence there, and yes, there's some American military influence there. But in terms of the economic engine driver of Africa, it is China. And I think that Trump's, dare I say, racist commentary has done a lot to ensure that when Africans think of who will they want to hitch their wagon to, it's not going to be America that comes to mind first and foremost, David.
I hope, almost beyond hope, that this is beneficial for the French and for the English in that it gives them an opportunity to engage with Africa in a meaningful way that is neither kind of American opportunism nor Chinese opportunism. The Americans have only ever been in Africa when it benefits them directly. China is only interested in making money immaterial of the consequences. In a sense, both countries are so upfront about their interests, their prejudices. The French and the English, where they have learnt from their experience of being imperial masters and now more and more trying to somehow be partners to offer something different to China. It's not as economically significant, but with Mugabe gone, there is potential for Africa to go, well, here's another opportunity to find the African political way forward, to be a little bit more liberal. And to say that they're going to end up with Western-style democracy anytime soon, well, highly unlikely. They don't have the resources, they don't have the experience, they're dealing with too many difficult things. But we've seen it's possible for it to transform and improve. And that the alternative to the Chinese is not the Americans. The alternative to the Chinese is the Europeans, or dare I say, if Australia ever wakes up from its strategic stupor, to look across the Indian Ocean and go, well, there's an African coastline and an Australian coastline with a big bit of water in the middle. We too could be a helpful player in providing, services, training, mentorship to help Africa build itself. So, fingers crossed, the Americans out of the game actually puts better people in the game.
Let's go back to Iran. David, Iranian President Ayatollah Hassan Rouhani mocked President Trump for having been unable to kill off the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, otherwise known as the Iran nuclear deal. Is Rouhani correct in mocking Trump for this failed policy promise? Or is it too early to say whether Trump will unilaterally withdraw American support for the Iran nuclear deal?
This is the irony of Iran, that the kind of mocking he seems to be doing is as if it's the Persian Empire mocking the young, silly Americans, not understanding, cultural and historical power. So I think mocking Trump and America is something that any Iranian administration has to do, because it's part of gaining swagger in their region. It's part of a way of finding ways to do business with Turkey. It's a way of doing business with Russia. It's part of finding this space where they can have an elbow up to hit the US in the chin, but just say, oh, it was only a joke. So I think it's absolute necessity for Iran to strut, because really its position is still relatively precarious in terms of, well, what could the world do if the Americans pull back from this deal? Everyone could conceivably pull back if everything unravels. So their aim is to, I think, isolate the Americans, apparently in their ignorance and youth, and let the grown-ups sit at the table.
That's one way of putting it. Mm-hmm. Here's another one. If we take Trump's position on Korea as a guide, Trump's threats to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal heaps added pressure on Tehran's Ayatollahs at a time that they're now struggling to maintain themselves and bring these nationwide anti-government protests under control. Now, if we look at the European partners of the Iran nuclear deal, they're all saying that the mullahs are doing fantastically well and we shouldn't do anything in terms of, breaking up this agreement, because essentially it keeps the Iranians from acquiring nuclear weapons. But you have to look at it from another perspective as well, and that is that Trump doesn't like Europeans either. Under current conditions, he's kind of sitting back thinking, there are a few Europeans I want to slap as well, and if I can seize the high moral ground here, I'm going to do so by then tweeting my support for the Iranian protesters, delegitimizing the idea of the Ayatollahs as being partners in anything, including the Iran nuclear deal, and thereby putting the Europeans under some sort of pressure by seeing that they're quite open in supporting what is, according to Trump, an illegitimate government oppressing the Iranian people. It's a strange thing to say, but I think that actually Trump is working a pro-Israeli, anti-Iranian, anti-European thing over the Iran issue. David?
I don't think he's working it. I think he fell into it.
Well, working it is like it's kind of it's not meant to be something of deliberation. It's meant to be almost like a stylistic.
Yes, it's working well for the Israelis.
Yes, it is.
So Trump is doing something that's working well for the Israelis, which then only benefits the Iranians again.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it benefits the Iranians up to a point. But we have to find out just how many Iranians are willing to rally around the flag of the government while the Iranian people are protesting all over Iran. And we have to also bear in mind that these protests that are going on in Iran are unlike those in 2009. In 2009, most of the protests were centered around Tehran, which is always a problem for any government ruling that country. But this time round, they're spontaneously breaking out all over the country. And this is important because in Iran, there is a city and country divide. Generally speaking, the people who are holding power, the Ayatollahs and their minions, are from the countryside. They're very conservative in their ideas and ideology. The urbane city folk are wanting to get, escape the oppression of the Ayatollahs. But at the moment, we're seeing country people who are feeling just as oppressed as the urban city people. Now, what happens when you end up having the urban city people hooking up with disenfranchised, poorer country folk is obviously a pre-revolutionary setting, I would suggest. And now we'll take our usual short musical interlude. You are listening to Strategicon, the podcast of SIA.
Love is but a song we sing, feels the way we die. You can make the mountains ring, or make the angels cry. Though the bird is on the wing, and you may not know why. Come on, people now, smile on your brother, everybody get together, try to love one another right now. Some may come and some may go, we will surely pass. When the one that left us here returns for us at last, we are but in moments of sunlight fading in the grass. Come on, people now, smile on your brother, everybody get together, try to love one another right now.
That was the 1967 folk rock classic Get Together from the Youngbloods. And now we'll return to Strategicon episode 42, Shock and Horror, 1 year of Trump's world disorder and what lies ahead.
It's similar to, in a sense, in China, where the poor in the north can now see they're poor because they've got the big flat screen TV and they become politically aware.
Exactly.
And suddenly the Chinese are fixating on, social equity. And the Iranians are going to have to move to that very quickly. So whether it be the Ayatollahs or the Revolutionary Guard, whoever's ruling in a year's time will have to do a better version of social equity. And if they do, can probably buy long-term power.
So in a strange kind of way, Trump can now paint the Europeans as defending the Ayatollahs while he's moving away from the Ayatollahs and threatening to withdraw from this deal that Obama had struck with the Ayatollahs. So that gives him this sort of moral authority where he's defending the poor, benighted Iranian people. In actual fact, he's not really giving that much thought to the poor, benighted Iranian people. He's only thinking about himself.
No, he's thinking Israeli issues, how to have stable issues.
Yeah.
And the Europeans are probably going to be grateful if they can avoid the press of the other two talking to each other.
So true.
Talking about President Trump withdrew American support for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, withdrew from the Paris Climate Accords, and has threatened to withdraw from the North American Free Trade Area. Now that arch economic nationalist Stephen Bannon has been ousted from the Trump White House, John, this question to you. Do you see Trump moving away from economic nationalism and drifting to a more globalist agenda?
This is a very complex question because, for a long time in the first part of the Trump White House, Steve Bannon was actually in charge of promoting American economic nationalism. But now that he's fallen from grace from the news agency Breitbart as well, and now he's been brought into the Mueller investigation on Russian interference, and it's all very...
You mean he stopped becoming president?
Well, President Bannon, Prince of Evil, he's now in a situation where he doesn't have any direct control, but unfortunately for Trump, because Bannon brought a lot of disaffected nationalist thinking people to Trump's campaign in the lead up to the 2016 election, if Trump moves radically back into a more globalist agenda, he would be betraying his base. So I think, weirdly enough, Bannon will exact his revenge by having planted the seed that Trump is an economic nationalist, which then puts him in a corner because Trump can't actually go against it. If he goes against it, he loses his base, he loses his legitimacy. And if we think that, a 40% or a 30% presidential polling is bad, can you imagine if Trump comes out and says, well, that Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think we're going to actually join it now. I think it's a good idea if we do that. I think all of a sudden you'll find the people who have been protesting so hard against all this globalist stuff will just leave Trump in a ditch.
David, is American economic nationalism dead?
I don't think so, and I think this is what we'll see over the next year to 18 months. Do enough people in America now understand the idea of economic nationalism, and will they associate that with Steve Bannon or some new figure to take that cause? Because as Donald Jr. said today, the only colour Donald Sr. likes is green, money. Wherever the money goes, the president will follow. And yet economic nationalism is still this incredibly relevant issue to the dispossessed working class of the United States. So you can perhaps take Trump out of the economic debate, but you can't stop the economic debate shaping American politics. And I think there's plenty of room for an alternate Republican candidate to take up the economic nationalist mantle, whether it be Bannon or be someone else. I think...
Hang on. Bannon, an alternate Republican candidate? Are you kidding me?
Oh no, he made the point in the Michael Wolff book that at the point he was about to be ditched from the White House, he was already wondering whether he'd stand in 2020. So it's in print.
Yeah, well...
Now, again, it seems to depend on how many coffees and how little sleep he's had.
But I think that's really the case, isn't it? I mean, I think he's deluding himself if he thinks he's even got a leg in for this. I think he'll go back to Hollywood and start making dodgy movies or something.
Yeah, but even if it's not him, the economic nationalist argument is still central to the future of America.
Yeah.
The Democrats aren't going to do anything to fix it. They can't conceive of how globalisation isn't nice. But on the Republican side, there is still ample room for any number of the more extreme right-wing candidates to take this on board, particularly as America will not use power effectively to find a new balance point with China. If you're not going to use conventional power, then maybe you need to play a different economic game. It's still on the table for the Republicans.
I have a question for you, David. It's about America and Russia. The Mueller investigation has so far failed to provide the smoking gun, clearly showing Moscow's hand in supporting the Trump candidacy. It has exposed lots of unsavory Trump family dealings with Russian business interests, but nothing conclusive on Russian political interference in favor of Donald Trump. This investigation has, however, failed to dampen Trump's ambition to find points of cooperation with Moscow internationally, especially with regard to Syria. Does the Trump presidency and its admiration of Russian leader Vladimir Putin provide Putin even more strategic space in which to operate? How do you think, John, David, this will affect Russia's frozen conflict in eastern Ukraine, its rising tensions with an increasingly fascist-leaning Poland and Hungary, and its strategic standoff with NATO over the Baltic states?
To start at the beginning, I think what it does for Putin is give him so much opportunity to fill the vacant space, where a Trump bromance, a desperate desire to be seen as being credible by Putin, just means the Russians can get away with stepping into all the empty space that the Americans' ineffectiveness can't fill. So whereas China and the United States are in a real standoff, the Americans are on the back foot and Russia's moving forward. It's an amazing opportunity when, an American president is in awe of a Russian president. It's a very strange thing. That freedom to act is incredible, and I'll hand over to John in a sec, but then that is going to, of course, roll into things like Ukraine and the relationship with Poland and Hungary, that Russia is just going to keep seeing how long the rope can be. Eventually Russia will hang itself. It doesn't have the resources, economic or military, to really follow through on some of its claims. But as a destabilising force, throughout Eastern Europe, it's got incredible potential.
Yeah, and one of the things that I find in Eastern Europe is that it's a kind of push me, pull you situation where, you know, you have got a real local constituency that is very much against immigration, against whatever. And so the Eastern European countries, in a very weird way, are trying to find their own strategic space, right? They don't like the Russians. They don't want the Russians back in. They are developing nasty strains of racism and racist philosophy within, as we say, you know, Poland, Hungary, even now Austria. You know, we've got almost like a Central European bloc of states who are drifting towards illiberal democracy as a theory, which in one way plays to Vladimir Putin. How much control he has over that, and whether or not he's running FSB operations in Vienna and Budapest and Warsaw is anyone's guess. But ultimately, he's got material that he can work with, or maybe that material is just so strong it's fermenting its own sort of rebellion against established conservative politics, if you will. So, you know, we've got this very odd situation. And then we have Trump, you know, and Trump, he loves Putin because he loves strong men, and he wants to be a strong man. He wants to be considered a strong man. And the bromance is something that's going to be a net detriment to the United States, because you're going to have State Department officials who will be mortified, or who have been mortified and continue to be mortified by the fact that, you know, the Trump presidency wants to find elements of cooperation in places like Syria and elsewhere. Because generally speaking, you know, when we look at the nature of American power in the international domain, we don't see the idea of that kind of cooperation between Russia and the United States. We see them as traditional enemies. How the Trump administration wants to continue to pursue this odd mishmash of foreign policy constructs with Vladimir Putin is anyone's guess. I think there's more confusion to be had as the year moves on, as 2018 moves on. There will be other opportunities by which Putin will reach out to Trump, and Trump will reach back out to Putin to find out areas of cooperation. But in the end, I think I think it's going to necessarily bite both of them in the backside for doing so. It's just antithetical to what Moscow and Washington are really all about.
Do you have anything to add up, David?
Yeah, that eventually, like John said, it will bite both of them, but for very different reasons. The Russians will hit the point of overextension because they've taken opportunity of too many strange circumstances and just don't have the wherewithal to follow through. Whereas it will bite the Americans when they realise they could have used power and influence and done something about it and stopped it, but they missed their opportunity. So they'll both suffer, but in very different ways.
And see, the other thing that I want to make mention here also is that, you know, Trump's kind of dismal attitude with regard to traditional Western European states has meant that they themselves don't want to necessarily be partners of this American administration, which means that now that the template has been set, where transatlantic cooperation is predicated on whether or not the European capitals have faith in Washington, well, if that's broken, the West Europeans are going to have to find their own way in which they can actually try to stop Russian predations in Eastern Europe. They're going to have to try to find their own way in which they can probably exercise a different sort of influence over the policymakers in Washington, D.C. You know, in many ways, perhaps Trump has done one thing for the world, and that is it's made all of America's allies and other neutral players think very carefully about American power and how we're meant to relate to it. Maybe it's now time for American allies to move out from, you know, under the shadow of American power. Maybe it's time for, you know, neutral powers to start developing their own sense of themselves in the international community. It will make for a much messier international community. It certainly won't be an orderly place, but perhaps it's a necessary place that we find ourselves in.
I agree. Now, questions about US-China. Now, John, was arguably the most chaotic US administration in living memory. Beijing must be opportunistically eyeing its holdings in the South China Sea and see great advantage in increasing its presence there. Arguably, nothing short of war will remove China's existing military and naval presence from the Spratly and Parcel Island. And no country wants war between the US and China because war is bad for business. Do you think President Xi Jinping will use American rudderlessness to his strategic advantage? And if so, how?
Look, I think that what we're seeing at the moment is a period of Chinese consolidation. China is not actively trying to push any further than it possibly can. I think that if we're looking at the anti-American forces in the world, and notably when we talk about anti-American forces, we're looking at Russia and China. China has a greater sense of its own limitations. Russia doesn't seem to have that. But at least with China, what they've done through very clever salami slicing tactics in the South China Sea, they have now created their presence there. Now, as you say, short of war, nothing is going to remove China's military presence, the Paracel Islands and Spratly Islands. That's it, And the weaker claimants, the weaker Southeast Asian claimants to that same body of water, need American military strength to push Chinese influence out. Now, if Trump's not willing to do that because, well, frankly, the US Navy's got some significant problems. We know that, last year there were a couple of incidents where American warships had collided with other vessels, and now apparently the captains responsible for those warships are up on charges. We also know that the US Navy, in spite of Trump wanting to beef up defense, defense is a net sucker in of money. I mean, where's the money coming from, Donald? We know that the US Navy has manning problems. We know that many of the captains and officers on watch are overtaxed, and they're required to do more and more because Donald Trump's eclectic way of management, just throws the military instrument out there and he wants a result. And if you're tired and you've not had your rest and recreation and you're probably taking methamphetamines to keep yourself awake, the idea of warships colliding with fishing boats and tugs and various other cargo ships is very high. An instrument that is not well prepped for confronting China, for instance, or Russia on the other side. Trump can stomp his foot all he likes and order his admirals and generals to do whatever, but the military is not ready to actually undertake these kind of actions. So China is now in a period, I think, of consolidation. It's got naval expansion on the books. It's building 3 aircraft carriers as we speak. And I think that given sufficient time and space, it will come to dominate the South China Sea. And I would even go so far as to say even the East China Sea. And arguably, once that has been accomplished, eventually we'll have to get used to Chinese warships patrolling into the Western Pacific as America's strategic footprint seems to lessen over time.
David?
I think a couple of things, and just things that reinforce what John said. The Chinese have been so careful to only bite off things they can chew. Everything has been so careful. So they've used the limited amount of force potential they have very effectively. But at home, they're pushing nationalism. So you could end up with a groundswell of nationalism that is greater than the Chinese capacity to influence and hold ground. And eventually have nationalism forcing China to use new, very expensive equipment that it doesn't have enough of, doesn't have enough experience of, putting all its gains at risk. Whereas the Americans, even in a slightly less than ideal case, still have masses of experience, masses of equipment, and even with personnel problems, are not struggling with the problem of a ratcheting up of nationalism, potentially making the mission more dangerous. So it's a strange combination that even though tactically China is making very careful decisions that seem to work and work well, the risk of nationalism at home might mean they go from this clever, slow strategy to an overreach out of nationalist necessity to buy off their own population.
If they do it from a position of strength, say for instance they do it in the South China Sea, they probably could get away with it. If they try to extend themselves beyond an area where they, have any coverage, then I think they're going to end up having problems.
Precisely.
Yeah.
David, it wouldn't be StrategiCon if it didn't include an Australian angle to world affairs. What do you think this year has in store for our country?
I think the big thing for us this year is to recognise that we can't keep hitching our wagon to other people. That, America at the moment, no one knows quite what the Trump administration will do, so perhaps we need a bit more distance there. But now it's, well, do we hitch our wagon to China? Chinese influence in Australia, whether it be in university, industry, media, is growing all the time. So our real issue is, who are we, what do we want to be, and are we going to take control of our own strategic destiny? The traditional Australian questions that are relevant every year, all year, endlessly, that we never quite resolve because of our inability to believe in ourselves.
John?
Look, I think that we've got to really think very carefully. I mean, I agree with David. We've got to think very carefully with regard to developing our own sense of self here in the South Pacific. Essentially, we have South Pacific Island states that are Africanized. They have major social, political, and economic problems. We're barely rating as relevant to this region. It's a region that essentially has, one of the world's largest marine resources in terms of fish. Who's defending that area from being pillaged by Asian trawlers who drift net the entire area and leave deserts, undersea deserts in its wake? I mean, this should be Australia's strategic responsibility. We are the largest power in this region. It should be our responsibility, in conjunction with South Pacific states, to actually go in there and cooperate in terms of making sure that, fishing is one of the things that is not just like an industry totally out of control and unaccountable. We should also look at Indonesia as a focus of our a strategic life here in Australia. Any threat to Australia will come from Indonesia or come through Indonesia. It's just a fact of life. And of course, we've got Papua New Guinea right next door to Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea is not a strong state, and obviously we'll be looking to Australia to help it were it to ever confront Indonesia over any particular problem. That complicates strategic relationships between Australia and Indonesia, but we need to be able to be open and discuss these things and create our own independent space. And as I think that the overall theme is, the Trump presidency in many ways is a bad presidency, but in many ways it's also an opportunity for us to reassess ourselves in the world. And for Australia, I think we need to reassess ourselves in the world. I don't think we ought to be sending penny packet forces, which cost us a lot of taxpayers' money, mind you, over to the Middle East and into Central Asia to do America's bidding. Ultimately, we have to think about the strategic mission. What does that do for Australia? Does it make us safe from terrorism? Obviously not. I mean, we can bomb any part of the Middle East all we like. All we're doing is if we make a mistake, we just make a hell of a lot more of a mess in that area, and people will be directing their fury at Australia. If we just kept to our particular region, we would be able to accomplish so much more in terms of generating peace, stability, and some sort of security architecture that would be for the collective good of our patch of the world.
Is there any issue that you guys would like to add into Australian key foreign policy for 2018? David?
No, I think really we could hypothesise about any of the things we've talked about further, but the only one that potentially I'd add, and it's not really an Australian issue, is that what happens if Venezuela falls over in South America? Because the other side of the big bit of water from us is South America.
Yeah.
And in the same way that we don't take Africa seriously and engage properly, we don't recognise that South America's our neighbour, and that we also need to be engaging there. So we need to look far afield in both directions, which we're not accustomed to doing.
Yeah. I think that really we should have a new national symbol. It's an old national symbol from the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, where you have the eagle with two heads looking east and west. That should be the Australian national symbol, because it's exactly what we ought to be doing. I would like to add one thing that we need to be looking at, and we'll keep a watchful eye at Sage International, and that is the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia that is being built currently. We're starting to hear reports that some very dangerous foreign policy issues are happening over there, where there's a new balance of power that's coming together. From an Ethiopian national perspective, it's really good because it allows hydroelectricity for Ethiopia to have the kind of energy needs for that country to grow. I mean, the country's got, almost 100 million people, so it needs that. But of course, what it does to the Nile River system is going to affect other countries further downstream. And obviously one of those major countries is Egypt. And I think that Egypt and Ethiopia are likely to be on a collision course if they cannot come up with a sounder, rational distribution of the water resources. So, yeah.
All right. John and David, thank you for your time and for your insights. Let's hope that this coming year will be as trouble-free as possible. This is Strategicon. I am Shekrizat Ayred, and that's the show for now. You can subscribe and download Strategicon through iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, and YouTube, as well as from sageinternational.org.au. If you want to know more about Sage International Australia, check out our page on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and our website sageinternational.org.au. Also, please support our efforts by telling your friends and colleagues about Strategicon and by liking us on our various podcast platforms. Until next time, goodbye from me, Shekrizat.
Goodbye from me, John.
Goodbye from me, David.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.